The Report Designer is a Visual Studio designer that brings together a collection of graphical tools hosted within SQL Server Data Tools in Visual Studio. In essence, it puts a pretty graphical interface on the process of creating a report definition file using report definition language, which is an XML-based language that describes reports and contains information used just by the designer. The designer includes a design pane for laying out the report components, as well as a report data pane that makes it easy to organize and access data for the report. It also includes a preview tab so that you can frequently view a preview of the report as you progress with building it. Report Designer is a developer tool. It's not intended for non-technical end users or even power users. Those kinds of users could certainly take the time to learn the tool, but it wouldn't be an efficient use of their time. But for report developers, particularly those already familiar with Visual Studio, Report Designer is a powerful tool that puts every reporting services feature at your fingertips. The end result of using the Report Project Wizard project template is a complete report definition, open for editing or preview in Report Designer. From that initial simple report, you can make the report as complex as you want, sometimes undoing some of the work of the wizard. But you don't have to start a new report that way. Instead, you can build a new report on a blank slate, and for that you'll want to use the Report Project template. There are several steps involved in creating a report using a blank Report Designer once you've created an empty report project. First, you create a report definition file, then you define a data source for the report, then define a data set, and then finally define the report layout. The actual steps that you take for a specific report depend on the characteristics of that report. But these steps are a high-level overview of what you're going to need to do to create most reports. Then, when you run or preview the report, Reporting Services retrieves the actual data from the database and combines it with the layout. And it renders it on your screen from where you can export it, print it, or save it. You can think of the report definition as a template that, when you combine it with data, produces a useful report for an end user. What I'm going to do now is create a customer contact list report using customer data from the AdventureWorks LT 2012 database. The starting point is going to be a blank report in the Report Designer, and I'll use its various graphical tools to build the report and then preview it. Alright, so here I am in an instance of SQL Server Data Tools that has the BI extensions installed. I'll go in here into File, New Project, select a Report Server project, and I'm just going to call this Simple Report. And I can select a particular location for it. I'll put it in my default Visual Studio 2012 projects folder. Alright, click there, and it creates the project. And once again, I have an empty solution, just has this folder structure. Alright, so now I need to add a report. I don't want to add new report because I don't want to use the wizard, so I'll select Add New Item, and I'll select the report, and I'll give it a meaningful name here. So I'm going to call it Customer Order List. Okay, it's going to have the extension .rdl. And I'll add that, and that adds that to Solution Explorer and opens up the blank report within the Report Designer. Now, notice that the main Designer pane here has two tabs, Design and Preview. You'll do most of your work in the Design tab, but then you can move to Preview as you need to check the appearance of the report. Alright, the next thing I need to do is define a data source for the report. And I'm going to do that using the Report Data pane of the Designer. So I'm going to select New and Data Source, and that opens up this Data Source Properties dialog box. I'm going to give it a meaningful name. I'll call it AdventureWorks LT 2012. Okay. Now, you don't have to name it the same name as the database. This is a name of an object. It's not something that causes it to link to that specific database, but that's a good convention. All right, now in this case, this is going to be a data source that is embedded within the report itself. So I'm going to leave this embedded connection option selected. But otherwise, I could use a shared data source reference if I wanted to, if there was an existing one that I could use within the project or on the server. And I could also create that if I selected that option. All right, but I'm going to use an embedded connection. I'm going to be connecting to Microsoft SQL Server. And then I need to create the connection string. I'll use the connection properties dialog box to do that. So server is going to be local, or I could use a remote server, I could use the machine name, whatever makes sense. I have all the permissions I need on this particular server, so I'll use Windows Authentication, but you can use SQL Server Authentication if that's what you need. And then I can select or enter a database name, and I'll select AdventureWorks LT 2012. Then I'll click on Test Connection. Everything's fine. If I needed to set any additional features, I could click on Advanced, but don't need to do that here. And I'll click on OK. And as you can see, that created the connection string for me. Now this is an editable text box, so I could just go ahead and enter the connection string directly, paste it in, or make modifications to this connection string. Whatever works for me. Alright, that's everything I need to do to configure the data source, so I'll click on OK. And as you can see, it appears there within the Report Data window, under, appropriately enough, the Data Sources folder. Alright, so now that I have a data source which tells Report where to get the data, I need to define a data set, which identifies the data that I want to retrieve from the database in the form of a query. Alright, so once again within the Report Data pane, I'll select New and Data Set, and that opens up the Data Set Properties dialog box. Alright, so I'm going to give this a meaningful name as well, and I'm going to call this Customer Order List Dataset. And I'm once again going to use the data set that's embedded in my report, but if I wanted to, I could use a shared data set if I had any available. Okay? But this is going to be embedded actually within the report definition file. In other words, I'm not going to share it with other reports. Okay, so then I need to select the data source. Notice that there's only one defined within this project, so it's pre-selected for me. But also note that I could create a new one here. So I didn't actually have to do that separate step of creating it out here. Using that new button there has ultimately the same effect, and then I could continue creating my data set. So whichever works better for you. Alright, now you need to create the query. You can type the query in here directly. One thing that people frequently do is open up Management Studio, create and fine-tune their queries there, and then paste them in here. That works fine. Or you can use the Query Designer in order to build it using a GUI. So that's optional to use here. And as you can see, I have this 4-paneled designer that allows me to enter tables, select tables and so forth, set properties for the various columns that I include, see the select statement that is created, and then ultimately test the query and see the data that it retrieves to make sure that I've gotten the query right. Okay, so first thing I need to do is select Add Table there. Alright, so that opens up this Add Table dialog box. And in this case, I want to select Customer, and I'll hold down the Control key. And I want to include Sales Order Header and Sales Order Detail. Alright, then I'll click Add to add those to the designer, and then close once I'm done there. Or I could have continued adding additional tables. So you can see that as I change things within the Query Designer, it's going to dynamically create this select statement for me. But you can also use that Add Tables dialog box to do things like add more tables or views or functions or synonyms. Okay, but this is all I need for this particular report, those 3 tables. Alright, I'm just going to rearrange them a little bit, make their relationships look a little bit easier to figure out. So as you can see, there are relationships defined within the database, and the designer picks those up. And so it can take advantage of those relationships in crafting the query. Alright, now I need to select the various fields that I want to include within the result set. So first from the customer table, and I can expand that a bit, And I'm going to select the customer ID, company name, the email address, and the phone number. So the report's going to display basic identifying and contact information in the report. But of course you can include whatever fields you want. Now I want to select some fields from the sales order header. And in this case I'm going to select the sales order ID, the order date, and then the total due, which I have to scroll down here, right there. And again you can see that the designer is automatically adding the fields that I select to the select statement. Okay, then I need to add the fields that I want to include from the sales order detail, and I'm going to include the product ID, the order quantity, and the line total. Okay, so basic information for a report that's going to display a customer's orders. Now I want to sort the resulting data set by the company name and the order date. You can do some sorting within a report, but in general it's better to do the sorting on the database server because that's going to be more efficient. But you can still allow dynamic sorting within the report. You have lots of flexibilities. Okay, so I want to come down here to the company name field and select the sort type. And I want to set it to ascending for company name. And then also sort by order date. Alright, so now I'm sorting on two fields. The other thing I can do is select the sort order. So notice that it automatically added a sort order of 1 for company name. And I can come down here and select that field and notice that because this was the second field that I selected, it's setting it to 2. But I can change those as I want to. Okay, now I'll click on the Run button because I want to check out the data that I have so far. And there it goes out and grabs some of the data from the database, and I can inspect those query results to make sure that that represents the data that I want to include within the report. Okay, everything looks fine. Scroll over here. Alright, it's great. So I'll click on OK, and that copies that query into the dialog box for me. Okay, so again, different ways of doing that. You can import from a file. You can copy and paste in directly, whatever you want to do. And you can also use stored procedures as well. Alright, now there's various other pages within this dialog box. So you have the option of doing things like renaming fields. You can set various options for the query. You can set filters. And then you can also set parameters. Now, this particular simple report that I'm creating doesn't need to change any of those settings. So I'm going to click on OK, and that creates that data set. So notice that I get a new data set within that folder, and then it also lists all of the fields that are going to be returned by that query. So now all of that data is going to be available for use in my new report.